Now, with more than 60% of South African youth unemployed, the Presidential Youth Employment Stimulus Program has supported more than 850,000 opportunities in its first two phases. That's according to President Cyril Ramaphosa. He says around 80% of all employment in South Africa is by the private sector. Ramaphosa says government needs to create the conditions that will allow the private sector to grow, create new products and to hire more employees. For more reaction, I'm joined by Ravi Naidu, the CEO of Youth Employment Services. Thank you very much, Ravi, for speaking to us here on All Angles. Of course, a lot of people had a lot to say after the president spoke yesterday. Some people said some of the plans look quite great. But, will they be implemented? Is there political will to implement those plans?
Thanks very much for having me on. Well, the president said all the right things, of course, as he has before. It's now just for him to be able to implement the right things. So I think that theme is still very much the case here. And certainly we shouldn't underestimate how difficult it is for him to implement. So I think that becomes the important thing. The statements and the intent is good, and I think everyone more or less lauds that and supports that. But now to implement, and you have to also see it from the point of view is he's making the statements, but the state capacity is not there to implement program. So where a program requires the government to do a lot to actually drive the implementation forward, can they do it?
Now, looking at what he said, particularly about the 350 social relief grant, for instance, he made a lot of examples about young people who were able to, create business and create jobs in turn because of that 350 rand. What's your reaction to the extension for a year? A lot of people would say it's important, but some people say 350 rand is simply not enough.
So those statements are all true. It is important, and 350 rand a month is obviously not enough. But what he's doing is simply extending the current temporary arrangement for another year while the rest of the plan must come into place, which is we need economic growth. If we don't have economic growth, unfortunately, even that 350 rand a month program, which amounts to 50 billion or thereabouts, is not sustainable. So what the president needs to do is buying time, is he has to take forward measures to boost economic growth, and also certain reforms in the economy to make it easier for employers to employ. But the social relief program is important. And he also spoke about a number of programs that will be supporting youth jobs directly. So not just the grant, but employment tax incentive being extended that subsidizes employers that hire young people, and special programs through the public sector, and then programs like ourselves that run through the private sector that work with young people.
Now, he put the blame, or rather he put the ball back in the court of the private sector, right, when he said it's the private sector that is supposed to create jobs and not necessarily government. But at the same time, as has been said throughout the course of this morning, it's about the type of environment or stability that is created by government to allow the private sector to actually get the investors to come into this country and create the jobs for the youth.
Yeah. So I heard it a little bit differently. So I heard the president asking for help. The president, I thought, understood the problem with state capacity, and the state capacity is going to take 15 years to fix, even at the most optimistic estimates. So what is he going to do now? Because we've got all these millions of people unemployed. So he was saying the role of the private sector is very important in terms of jobs. 4 out of every 5 people are employed in the private sector, and that's where economic growth comes from. So he was talking about, let's get a social compact together. But he gave the example, I don't know if you recall, about the Solidarity Fund and how 3,000 businesses helped with COVID, funding and launching programs. So he was almost saying, well, we're in the situation, how do we now really take a partnership forward, but bringing in an understanding of the role of the private sector, which the private sector, I think, understands. It's more that within the government and the partners working with the president on the political side need to also understand that if the private sector is most of the economy and most of where the jobs are going to come from, how do you give them a role in that process?
Ravi, I'm being told that I've run out of time, but I just want to ask you, the Presidential Youth Employment Stimulus Program, he says it's benefited almost 1 million people, 1 million youth, 850,000, or has created that many opportunities. It doesn't look that way on the ground, right? Judging from the fact that 60% of South African youth is unemployed and our unemployment rate keeps going up. So you, as a person who works with the youth in business, are you seeing this that he told us yesterday? Because we're not seeing it.
Well, I think so. The scale of the problem is massive. So we're looking at about 6 million jobs that you have to create now, and that's excluding the people who are still coming in. So even if you're talking about, I think the president spoke about 850,000 opportunities, and these are also in terms of the progress. Some of the programs are short term. 3 to 5 months. The program we run is a year, but altogether it may be close to 1 million people, but the scale is many, many times more than that. So it's important to run these programs because you have to do something now. Even while you're fixing Eskom and Portnet, the rest, people need jobs now. So I think it's short-term measures, but at the same time, they must also support making people more employable and get skills for the long-term economic growth. So they work together.
Thank you so much for your time and for indulging us. That is Ravi Naidu. He's the CEO of the Youth Employment Service, reacting to yesterday's State of the Nation address by President Cyril Ramaphosa.